a small-town courthouse in Alabama, 2003. Ray Moore stands defiantly beside a granite monument weighing over 2 tons carved with the Ten Commandments. Federal marshals approach with orders to remove it. Thousands of supporters have gathered, some weeping, others praying, many shouting. But across the street, a different kind of crowd has assembled. Lawyers, activists, and ordinary citizens who fought for this moment for years. They're not celebrating the removal of religion from public life. They're celebrating something far more profound, the recognition that in America, government belongs to all citizens regardless of what they believe about God. This is the story you've never been told about one of the most significant cultural shifts in modern American history. While headlines focus on the decline of religious belief, they've missed the real story. The rise of an organized, strategic, and surprisingly influential secular movement that has quietly reshaped American law, politics, and culture over the past century. The woman who started it all never intended to become a household name, and she certainly never expected death threats. It was 1959 in Baltimore, and Madalyn Murray was a single mother struggling to make ends meet. Her teenage son William had been forced to participate in mandatory Bible readings at his public high school, a daily ritual that had persisted in American schools since the colonial era. Most parents accepted this as normal, even beneficial. Madalyn Murray saw it as a violation of her family's constitutional rights. What happened next would change America forever, though few realized it at the time. Murray filed a lawsuit that would eventually reach the Supreme Court and end government-sponsored prayer in public schools nationwide. But here's what's fascinating. She didn't start with grand ambitions to transform American society. She simply refused to accept that her son should be compelled to participate in religious exercises that contradicted their family's beliefs. The backlash was immediate and vicious. Murray received thousands of hate letters, death threats, and was regularly burned in effigy at protests. She was called the most hated woman in America, a title she wore with defiant pride. But despite the personal cost, Murray's victory in the 1963 Supreme Court case, Murray versus Curlett, decided alongside the more famous Abington School District versus Schempp, marked the beginning of something unprecedented in human history. The systematic legal separation of religious authority from government power in the world's most powerful nation. Here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. The removal of prayer from schools wasn't the end goal. It was just the beginning. Murray understood something that her critics didn't. Legal precedent is like a river cutting through rock. One successful case creates the pathway for dozens more. In 1963, she founded American Atheists, the first major organization dedicated to protecting the civil rights of non-religious Americans and advancing the separation of church and state. But Murray was operating in a hostile environment. In the 1960s, acknowledging that you didn't believe in God was social suicide for most Americans. Atheists couldn't hold public office in many states, laws that remain on the books today, though they're unenforceable. Politicians routinely declared America a Christian nation, and few dared to disagree publicly. The idea that non-religious Americans might organize politically seemed absurd to most observers. What they didn't see was the demographic tsunami building beneath the surface. In 1962, only 4% of Americans claimed no religious affiliation. By 1990, that number had doubled to 8%. By 2020, it had reached 23%, making the religiously unaffiliated the fastest-growing belief category in America. But raw numbers tell only part of the story. The secular movement's real power came from its strategic focus on law, education, and culture. Let me tell you about Annie Laurie Gaylor, a young journalist who in 1976 co-founded the Freedom from Religion Foundation in Madison, Wisconsin. Unlike Murray's confrontational approach, Gaylor understood that lasting change required careful legal strategy, public education, and coalition building. The foundation began filing precise, well-researched lawsuits challenging government endorsement of religion, while simultaneously educating Americans about the constitutional principle of church-state separation. Their breakthrough came in 1986 when they sued to remove a statue of the Roman goddess Diana from a public park in Madison, not because they opposed Roman mythology, but because the city had refused to allow secular groups to place monuments while permitting religious displays. They won, establishing a crucial precedent that government can't play favorites among different belief systems. But here's where the movement showed its true sophistication. Rather than simply opposing religious displays, secular organizations began demanding equal treatment. When courthouses displayed the Ten Commandments, secular groups requested space for historical documents about the Constitution. When cities permitted nativity scenes, they insisted on including winter solstice displays or atheist messages. This strategic shift from opposition to inclusion proved devastatingly effective. The case that changed everything came from an unexpected source: a small-town display in Oklahoma. In 2009, the state erected a monument to the Ten Commandments on the grounds of the state capitol. The Satanic Temple, a secular organization using religious satire to highlight constitutional violations, responded by demanding space for their own monument: a bronze statue of the goat-headed deity Baphomet. The resulting media frenzy exposed the logical inconsistency of government religious displays to millions of Americans. Oklahoma faced an impossible choice: allow a satanic monument on government property or remove all religious displays. They chose removal, setting a precedent that reverberated across the nation. Conservative legislators who had championed religious displays suddenly understood the implications of their position when faced with religions they found objectionable. This brings us to one of the most misunderstood aspects of the secular movement. It's not primarily about atheism or opposing religion. The most effective secular organizations focus relentlessly on constitutional principles that protect all Americans regardless of their beliefs. When they challenge government funding of religious schools, they're protecting taxpayers who shouldn't be forced to support religions they disagree with. When they oppose religious tests for public office, they're defending the right of all Americans to participate in democracy. Consider the case of Susan Brogdon, a military nurse who in 2010 was forced to participate in a government-sponsored prayer breakfast at her Army base. When she politely declined, she faced harassment and professional retaliation. The Military Religious Freedom Foundation, led by former Air Force officer Mikey Weinstein, took her case and won a landmark settlement that protected the rights of non-religious service members throughout the military. What's remarkable about Weinstein's organization is that 95% of their clients are Christians who are being pressured to conform to specific religious practices by their commanding officers. This illustrates a crucial point that the secular movement has always understood. Separation of church and state protects everyone's religious freedom by preventing any single interpretation of faith from being imposed by government authority. The movement's influence extends far beyond the courtroom. In academic circles, secular scholars have fundamentally altered how we understand American history. For generations, textbooks portrayed the United States as a fundamentally Christian nation that graciously tolerated other faiths. Secular historians have revealed a more complex reality. Many of the founders were deists or skeptics who deliberately designed a secular government structure specifically to prevent religious faction from dominating political life. Thomas Jefferson's 1802 letter to the Danbury Baptists, where he wrote about a wall of separation between church and state, wasn't a throwaway line. It was a core principle that emerged from the founders' study of European religious wars and their determination to avoid similar conflicts in America. James Madison's memorial and remonstrance against religious assessments argued that government support for religion corrupts both government and religion itself. But perhaps the most significant victory for the secular movement came in an unlikely form: the Internet. In the 1990s, Americans who questioned religious authority often felt isolated and alone. Traditional media rarely covered secular perspectives positively, and most communities offered no support for non-religious individuals. The Internet changed everything overnight. Suddenly, teenagers in conservative religious families could access scientific information about evolution, historical criticism of religious texts, and philosophical arguments for secular worldviews. College students could connect with others who shared their doubts about faith. adults could discover that their skepticism about religion was shared by millions of other Americans. The results were dramatic. Online communities like Reddit's Atheist Forum grew to millions of members. YouTube channels dedicated to secular perspectives attracted massive audiences. Podcasts exploring religion, science, and philosophy gave voice to perspectives that had been marginalized in traditional media. The stigma around non-belief began to erode as Americans realized how many of their neighbors, colleagues, and friends shared similar views. Quick question for all of you watching. Where in the world are you watching this from, and what's your profession? Are you a teacher exploring these ideas for the first time, a student researching for a project, or perhaps someone who's lived through these changes firsthand? Drop your answer in the comments. Professor Archive here, and I love learning about the diverse backgrounds of viewers who find these historical deep dives as fascinating as I do. Whether you're watching from Tokyo, Tennessee, or anywhere in between, you're part of this ongoing story of how ideas shape society. This digital revolution coincided with another major development, the emergence of secular megachurches. I know that sounds like a contradiction, but hear me out. Organizations like Sunday Assembly began offering the community ritual and meaning that many people found valuable in religious congregations, but without supernatural beliefs. These gatherings featured inspiring speakers, community service projects, and social connections. Everything that made churches attractive to many people minus the theology. The success of these secular congregations revealed something important. Many Americans were drawn to religious communities not primarily for the beliefs, but for the sense of purpose, belonging, and mutual support they provided. Secular organizations that could offer these benefits while respecting diverse philosophical perspectives found enthusiastic audiences in major cities across the country. Meanwhile, in the political arena, the secular movement was achieving victories that would have seemed impossible decades earlier. The 2008 presidential election marked the first time a major candidate, Barack Obama, acknowledged non-believers in his inaugural address, stating that America was a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. It was a single phrase, but it represented official recognition that non-religious Americans were legitimate participants in the national community. The 2016 Democratic primary took this even further, when Bernie Sanders, whose religious views were ambiguous at best, became a serious contender for the presidency without facing significant criticism for his secular perspective. While Sanders didn't win the nomination, his success demonstrated that American voters were increasingly comfortable with candidates who didn't emphasize personal faith as a qualification for office. But the secular movement's most profound impact may be generational. Americans born after 1980 are significantly less religious than their parents and grandparents, but they're also more tolerant of religious diversity and more committed to church-state separation. They've grown up in an America where secular perspectives are part of the mainstream conversation rather than fringe positions. This generational shift is creating interesting political dynamics. Young evangelical Christians often support church-state separation, not despite their faith, but because of it. They've seen how political involvement has corrupted religious institutions and damaged Christianity's reputation among their peers. Many prefer a model where churches focus on spiritual and charitable work while leaving politics to secular democratic institutions. The movement has also produced unexpected cultural figures who challenge stereotypes about what secular Americans look like. Comedian Julia Sweeney's monologue, "Letting Go of God," brought humor and humanity to the experience of losing faith, showing audiences that atheism wasn't necessarily angry or bitter. Scientist Neil deGrasse Tyson became a beloved public figure while advocating for secular, evidence-based approaches to understanding the universe. Authors like Sam Harris, Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, and Christopher Hitchens, dubbed the Four Horsemen of New Atheism, wrote best-selling books that brought secular philosophy to mainstream audiences. While critics accused them of being militant or anti-religious, their actual message was more nuanced. They argued that supernatural claims should be subject to the same standards of evidence we apply to other important questions. Perhaps more significantly, these authors demonstrated that secular worldviews could be inspiring rather than depressing. They argued that a universe without supernatural purpose was more wonderful, not less, because it made human choices and achievements genuinely meaningful. They suggested that morality based on reason and compassion was more robust than morality based on obedience to authority. The movement's legal victories continued to accumulate throughout the 2000s and 2010s. When President George W. Bush created the Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives to fund religious organizations providing social services, secular groups successfully demanded equal access to federal funding for comparable programs run by non-religious organizations. When the city of Pensacola, Florida, wanted to display a large cross in a public park, the Freedom from Religion Foundation negotiated a compromise that allowed the display while requiring equal space for secular messages about the constitutional principles of church-state separation. The resulting display educated thousands of visitors about the historical reasoning behind America's secular government structure. One of the most fascinating aspects of the secular movement's strategy has been its embrace of religious freedom arguments. Rather than opposing religion, secular organizations position themselves as defending the authentic religious liberty that requires freedom from government interference in matters of conscience. This approach has proven remarkably effective because it aligns with deeply held American values about individual freedom and limited government. Take the case of pharmacy workers who were fired for refusing to dispense emergency contraception on religious grounds. Secular organizations supported the pharmacists' right to their religious beliefs while insisting that patients had equal rights to legal medical treatments. The solution they advocated, allowing religious employees to transfer such requests to willing colleagues, protected both religious freedom and consumer rights. This nuanced approach has helped the secular movement build coalitions with unexpected allies. When Muslim communities face discrimination, or when Jewish students are pressured to participate in Christian prayers at graduation ceremonies, secular organizations often provide the most effective legal support. They've learned that protecting minority rights against majority pressure serves everyone's interest in a diverse democracy. The movement has also had to grapple with internal diversity as it's grown. The atheist community includes conservatives who focus primarily on church-state separation, and progressives who see secularism as part of broader social justice causes. It includes former believers who maintain respectful relationships with religious family members, and lifelong skeptics who view religion as fundamentally harmful. These internal debates have sometimes been contentious, particularly around issues of gender equality, racial diversity, and political strategy. The movement that began with middle-class white activists has had to confront its own blind spots as it's attracted more diverse membership. Organizations like Black Nonbelievers and Ex-Muslims of North America have challenged the secular movement to address issues specific to their communities. Women have played particularly crucial roles in shaping the secular movement, though their contributions haven't always received appropriate recognition. Beyond Madalyn Murray and Annie Laurie Gaylor, figures like Susan Jacoby have written definitive histories of American secularism, while activists like Jennifer Michael Hecht have developed secular approaches to life's biggest questions about meaning and mortality. The rise of women's leadership in secular organizations reflects broader changes in American society, but it's also created productive tensions within communities that historically were dominated by male voices. Women leaders have often emphasized the connection between church-state separation and reproductive rights, bringing feminist perspectives to constitutional arguments. As we move into the 2020s, the American secular movement faces new challenges and opportunities. The Supreme Court has become more conservative, creating uncertainty about future church-state separation cases. Political polarization has made some Americans more religious, while pushing others away from faith communities they see as too political. But demographic trends continue to favor secular perspectives. Religious nones, Americans who claim no religious affiliation, now constitute the largest single belief category in many states. More significantly, they include many Americans who maintain spiritual beliefs while rejecting organized religion's political involvement. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated many trends that benefit the secular movement. When churches were forced to close, Americans discovered they could maintain community connections through digital platforms rather than physical congregations. When religious leaders contradicted public health guidance, many Americans prioritized scientific expertise over religious authority. Climate change presents another opportunity for secular organizations to demonstrate the practical value of evidence-based decision-making. While some religious groups have embraced environmental stewardship, others have resisted climate science or argued that environmental problems will be solved by divine intervention rather than human action. The secular movement's approach to these challenges emphasizes human agency and responsibility. Rather than waiting for supernatural salvation, secular Americans argue for immediate action based on scientific understanding of environmental systems. This perspective resonates particularly strongly with younger Americans who will bear the consequences of current environmental policies. International developments are also shaping American secularism. The rise of religious extremism globally has made many Americans more appreciative of church-state separation as a bulwark against theocracy. When they see how religious authority operates in countries without constitutional protections for secular government, Americans often develop stronger support for the First Amendment. Conversely, the success of secular societies in Northern Europe provides models for what America might look like with stronger church-state separation. Countries like Denmark and Sweden maintain high levels of social trust, low crime rates, and effective democratic institutions while being among the least religious societies in human history. These international comparisons help secular Americans articulate positive visions for their movement's goals. Rather than simply opposing religious influence in government, they can point to successful examples of societies that prioritize secular approaches to public policy while protecting individual religious freedom. The movement has also had to adapt to changing media landscapes. Traditional television and print media often ignored or misrepresented secular perspectives, but social media platforms have allowed secular content creators to build massive audiences directly. Podcasts like The Atheist Experience and YouTube channels like Theremin Trees have educated millions of viewers about secular philosophy and church-state separation. This digital success has created new opportunities for political influence. When secular content creators mobilize their audiences around specific legislation or court cases, they can generate thousands of contacts to lawmakers virtually overnight. Their decentralized but coordinated advocacy has proven surprisingly effective at influencing political outcomes. Looking toward the future, the American secular movement faces questions about its ultimate objectives. Some activists envision an America where religious belief becomes as private and personally irrelevant as other lifestyle choices. Others hope for a society where religious and secular Americans cooperate more effectively on shared challenges while respecting their philosophical differences. What seems certain is that the movement has permanently altered American political and cultural landscapes. Ideas that seemed radical when Madalyn Murray challenged school prayer in 1959 are now mainstream positions supported by significant portions of the population. The principle that government should remain neutral on religious questions has become embedded in legal precedent and cultural expectations. Perhaps most importantly, the secular movement has demonstrated that Americans can organize around shared civic values rather than shared supernatural beliefs. In an era when religious differences often drive conflict, the secular model offers an alternative approach to building community based on constitutional principles, scientific understanding, and humanistic ethics. The story of American secularism is ultimately a story about the evolution of freedom itself. Each legal victory, each cultural shift, each generational change has expanded the definition of who counts as a full participant in American democracy. The movement that began with one angry mother refusing to let her son be compelled to participate in prayers, he didn't believe has grown into a sophisticated network of organizations protecting the rights of all Americans to follow their consciences in matters of ultimate concern. Whether you're religious, secular, or somewhere in between, this movement has shaped the America you live in today. The wall of separation between church and state that protects your freedom to believe or not believe as you choose exists because thousands of Americans over decades fought to build it, brick by brick, case by case, one victory at a time. And this story is far from over. As America becomes more diverse religiously and philosophically, the principles that the secular movement has championed, government neutrality, evidence-based policy, and equal protection regardless of belief, become more essential than ever. The future of American democracy may well depend on our ability to live up to the secular ideals that our founders embedded in the Constitution, but that each generation must fight to preserve. So the next time you see a courthouse without religious monuments, a public school that teaches science without religious interference, or a politician who represents all constituents regardless of their faith, remember the ordinary Americans who made those freedoms possible. Their legacy lives on in every American who can participate fully in democratic life without being required to conform to someone else's religious beliefs. The American secular movement isn't just a growing force, it's a fundamental part of what makes America, America. And its story is still being written,